Hello everyone, and welcome once again to Caleb Likes Books. Today I'm going to be doing a book series review, which is not something that I've done in quite a while. And today I'm going to be talking about the Percy Jackson and the Olympians series by Riordan. I recently finished the series, at least the original 5 books. There are some new books being published in the series now, but of the original 5 books, I finished them all recently and read them over the course of about the last little under a year or so, I think. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the series as a whole, what I liked about it, what I didn't like so much about it, and kind of just talking about the series in general. If you are interested in my thoughts on each book individually, I do have reviews for each of these books on my channel, but a lot of the stuff that I have to say about each book is stuff that I'd also say about the entire series, and so you can probably just watch this video and you'll get a good idea of my thoughts on each book pretty much. But if you want my specific thoughts on the individual books, you can go check out my reviews. So for those who don't necessarily know a whole lot about this series, the basic premise of this series is you follow Percy Jackson, who's obviously the main character of the series, you know, it's named after him. And he is this kind of prophesied demigod child. He's the child of Poseidon and a human. And so he has been is supposed to fulfill this prophecy and things like this in order to stop the god Kronos from doing some pretty bad stuff. And this series is heavily based in Greek mythology, and things like that. And so he goes to this camp called Camp Half-Blood, which is where he meets up with a whole bunch of other people who are like demigods and half-blood, you know, human god people and things like that, and trains and learns and all this stuff, and basically goes on a bunch of different quests in order to further himself to this goal of preparing to take down Kronos. And so that's kind of the basic pitch of this series. So each book is kind of its own little quest that Percy and his friends go on. In the first one, for example, the lightning thief, he is going to find the missing lightning bolts of Zeus. In the Battle of the Labyrinth, they have to go through the labyrinth to do some stuff, things like that. You know, each book has its own kind of quest that the characters have to go on, leading up into the final book, which is kind of the big final battle. The structure of this series, I think, is pretty predictable. You know, you read one or two of them and you kind of know how the rest are going to go, which for some may be a little irritating. I personally found it to get a little stale as the series went on, but it didn't really feel that way until book 4, and by the time, you know, book 5 is kind of the unique one in the series, I think, so it wasn't too much of an issue. But you know, each book is kind of similar, I think, in most ways. So if you read like the first book and you enjoy it, you will probably enjoy the rest of the books. If you're not quite into it, then you probably won't enjoy the series. Personally, I did find it quite enjoyable. But as far as stuff that the series does really well, I think there's a few big standouts for, I think, what this series does very well. First things first is the mythology aspect. I was never huge into Greek mythology, but this series did kind of help me to learn a little bit more baseline knowledge. It doesn't go super deep into Greek mythology or anything like that, but it does a good job of incorporating mythological elements that are familiar to most people, I would say, who have kind of a basic knowledge of Greek mythology, and does a good job of introducing those elements into the series in order to add to the more fantastical side of things. Because this is a series that takes place in our world on Earth, but it takes place in like a fantastical version in which there are these gods and these creatures from mythology and things like that. And so I think it does a very good job of incorporating those mythological elements and doing so in a way that makes for, I think, a good introduction also to Greek mythology. So if you are, you know, wanting to see, like, if you have a child or something like that, you know, a young child who you want to get some into some reading, I think this is a good one to introduce them to Greek mythology if they happen to have an interest in that, because it does do a very good job of introducing those elements. Like for me, like I said, I had only the very basic knowledge of Greek mythology, and it did a good job of introducing those elements in a way that makes sense and that works. And so I think that's a kind of a good entry point if your child is like interested in Greek mythology or things like that. All of it is incorporated very well and is integral to the plot and interesting and all those things. The other thing that I really liked about this series was the narrative voice. The whole series is taking place from the first person point of view of Percy. So it's told in a first person perspective through his voice, and Percy has a very distinctive and unique voice. It's not, like a first person where it's just kind of generic, it could be anybody. It's very much like Percy has a distinctive voice to him that is somewhat humorous. A lot of the humor in this series comes from the narrative voice that is used for Percy, which makes the books, I think, a much more entertaining read because it really just has that kind of comedic value to it. And also just you get a good sense of like the way he views people and the way he views the world and things like that. He's also dyslexic, and that comes into things in the series as well, especially considering that it takes place from his perspective. And so, I think it does a very good job of having a unique narrative voice, which I really enjoyed and is one of the aspects of the series that I personally liked the most. This series, I think, was very entertaining, largely due to that, because there was always some funny little quip that Percy would insert into the story and things like that, or the way that he would describe things or people was often very entertaining and amusing. So I really enjoyed that about this series also. The story and the characters of the series, I think, are pretty decent. They're not the most memorable aspects of the books to me, but I did enjoy them. I think that each book having its own kind of quest, like each one following a similar formula, but just doing different things. Like you always have Percy, and then you have a couple of his friends, and it's usually different groups of friends. So you have, Annabeth, you have Grover, you have Tyson, you have a few other ones as well. And these characters tend to swap out between books. And so in one book, you might have Percy, Annabeth, and Tyson. In another book, you might have Percy, Annabeth, and Grover. In another book, you might have another character instead of Annabeth, or things like that. So it cycles out all the different characters. So they all get a good amount of time to spend with them, which I enjoyed, and you get to see the different dynamics between each of these characters. And it allows, I think it works well, because especially for like a middle grade or young adult, whatever this series would be classified as, works very well for that kind of younger demographic, because you're able to have a lot of different characters, but not have them in a way that might be overwhelming for someone who's not used to something like that, whereas something like epic fantasy, where you have a lot of different characters, where this series has a lot of different characters, but they are not all present at the same time. And so that kind of lets you get used to one set of characters, and then you can move on to another set of characters in a different book or things like that. I think that works really well. And the characters themselves, I think, were fun and memorable and interesting. And they all have interesting quirks to them that I really enjoyed. I'm particularly a big fan of Tyson and Grover. They're probably my favorite characters in the series, I would say. I think especially Tyson. But and that goes for all the gods too, whether they be the major Greek gods or the minor gods or things like that, or even the different antagonistic characters, the different villains and things like that. All the characters in the series, whether they're major or minor, have a distinctive personality to them, which I really enjoyed. And it's not like a series where I think you get really super deeply into the characters, but they all feel well written, well fleshed out, not necessarily in a super deep way, but in a way that really kind of makes you connect with each character and say, this is what this character is, and they have their own distinctive qualities that are different from this other character, which are different from this other third character, and things like that. I think that was all done really well also. And as far as the plots, like I said, kind of formulaic. So once you read one book, you kind of know how the rest are going to go in terms of general structure. But I think that works very well for this type of series as well. And, I think it's a variable enough structure that it still makes things interesting, because you can kind of change what the goal is. You can change which characters are going to be involved, things like that. But each book, even though it has this separate quest that the characters go on in each book, it still has that through line of character development and character relationships and dynamics that build across the series, and things like that. I also really enjoyed the action in this series. It's not super duper prevalent throughout the series. It does play a role in each book, but it doesn't get super heavily involved, I would say, until the last book, which I would say is like half just full action. Like the first half is kind of building, and then the second half is a lot of action going on. And I think the action's well done. It's nothing like super gratuitous or anything like that. Obviously, you know, it's a kid's series, but it's done well and is exciting and fun to read, and things like that also. As far as some drawbacks of the series, things that I didn't like quite so much, there's not a huge amount. I do think for me, like I said earlier, the structure of the series did kind of start to get stale, I think around book 3 or 4. And it just kind of started to feel like it was just kind of repeating a lot of the same kind of ideas, which works for I think the audience that this book is written for decently. You know, like I said, it's a formulaic series, but it's one where there's enough variety within that formula to keep things interesting. But it is something that I think should be pointed out, at least that's the way that I perceived it. And also the overarching plot of this series and each book didn't really compel me that much. I think the moment to moment of this series was really good. I think like each individual chapter is very enjoyable to read, but the overall story didn't really do a whole lot for me. But then again, that may just be because of the type of story this is, you know, and obviously I'm not quite in the demographic for this series. So it's possible that if you are a younger person, you may enjoy that aspect of the series more than I do, or things like that. But that was probably my least favorite aspect of the series in terms of like what I think of as like the core pillars of a story being like the setting, the characters, and the plot. The plot was probably the weakest link for me, I would say. Whereas I really enjoyed the characters, I really enjoyed the setting, I really enjoyed the narrative voice, things like that. But the plot was not quite as interesting to me, but your mileage will probably vary on that. As far as how I felt about each book, I really enjoyed each book in this series quite a bit. I do think that my least favorite one of the bunch was book 4, Battle of the Labyrinth, but I think that was, like I said, mostly because by that point I was just kind of feeling like the series was getting kind of samey. The book itself was still fine, did everything just as well and just the same as all the other books. It just, by that point I was kind of want something a little different, which I think made the last book, which I would say is probably my favorite in the series, even better because it is such a departure. It's, I think, darker than the other books in the series, and has a very big build-up and then a big climactic whole section of the book, which I really enjoyed. But I enjoyed each of these books. In terms of like rating them and things like that, I'd give like each one like an 8 out of 10-ish. With a little bit of variance. Battle of the Labyrinth I gave a bit lower in my original review. I would still say, like, removing that subjective aspect of I didn't like how samey it felt, like it's just as consistently decent and things as the rest of the series is. So each book I would say is like 8 out of 10-ish for me, with the last book bumping up a little bit. I think I gave that a 9. But I think that this series is very consistent in its quality. You read, you know, the first 1 or 2 and you kind of know like you're probably going to like all the rest of the books about that same amount. I think it's a very consistent series in terms of the way that it's written, in terms of the tone. It does get a bit darker at times as the series goes along, but generally pretty consistent, very consistent in enjoyability, I think, things like that. So if you read like the first book, like I said, and you enjoy it, I think you'll enjoy the whole series. So that pretty much wraps up my thoughts on the Percy Jackson series. Let me know in the comments if you've read this series before and what you thought of it, or if you're interested in reading it. I may read the other books that are set in this kind of world. I know there are several other, not necessarily Percy Jackson series, but other series by the same author taking place in the same setting, which I might read some of those at some point. If you've read those as well, let me know in the comments what you think of them, and if you think I should check them out at some point. And yeah, that's pretty much it for this video. So thank you all for watching, and I will see you all next time.